Vivid verses.
There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a relationship when one person has decided to leave and the other hasn't figured it out yet. It's not peaceful. It's the quiet of a rope pulled taut, that specific humming tension between the last thing said and the next thing that will change everything. I had been living inside that quiet for 3 weeks by the time I started packing the first box. I did it on a Tuesday afternoon, while Cassandra was at her sister's. Not because I was hiding it from her. I wasn't, but because I'd learned over the course of our time together that the first stage of anything difficult was always easier to begin in silence. You could think more clearly. You could hear yourself. You could decide, without the static of her reaction drowning out your own logic, whether you were sure. I was sure. I stacked the box near the hallway closet and made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, and I wrote down everything I needed to do over the next 10 days. Arrange temporary housing, notify the appropriate people, separate the finances, handle the shared subscriptions, and small material entanglements that accumulate like sediment in any shared life. I wrote it all down in the order it needed to happen. I'm not naturally a list maker, but when things get complicated, I find a certain clarity in the act of sequencing, in reducing what feels enormous into a series of individual steps, each one finite, each one achievable. It's not that it makes hard things easy. It's that it makes them real and reality I can navigate. It's the abstract weight of an unlabeled thing that tends to paralyze people. Name it, order it, handle it. That's always been my approach. I finished the coffee and made another and sat there reading the list. I revised 2 items. I added a third I'd forgotten. I read it again and decided it was complete. The apartment felt different already. Not bad exactly, just altered, like a room with the furniture rearranged. Everything structurally the same, the light falling through the same windows at the same angles, but the familiar shape of it subtly, irrevocably changed. I met Cassandra at a dinner party hosted by a mutual friend. A small gathering, 7 or 8 people around a table that probably seated 6 comfortably. The kind of evening that starts with wine and ends with everyone staying 2 hours longer than they planned. She was funny that night, genuinely funny, with a dry wit and a storyteller's timing, and she laughed with her whole face in a way that made you feel included in the joke rather than observed by it. I remember thinking as we stood on the front step afterward waiting for separate ride shares and talking about nothing in particular, a film she'd seen, something absurd that had happened to me that week, that she was one of those rare people who was exactly as interesting as she first appeared. No performance running under the surface. No sense that she was showing you a curated version and waiting for you to commit before revealing the rest. I still think that, in a way. The problem wasn't that she turned out to be something different than what she'd seemed. The problem was that she was entirely, completely herself. And some of what she was had taken me a long time to see clearly, because some of what she was had been subtle enough that it could pass for a long time as ordinary relationship friction, as the normal adjustments 2 people make, as compromise and accommodation and love expressed as yielding. Cassandra operated on a system I come to think of privately as the emotional ledger. Every kindness she extended was entered as a credit. Every patience I demonstrated, every accommodation I made, every time I prioritized her comfort over my own preference, every time I softened a position because she looked wounded, all of it was logged, and the expectation was that the balance would always be available for withdrawal, not in any calculated or cynical way. I don't think she was aware of it as a system. I want to be precise about that, because the difference matters. She didn't sit down and design it. It was simply the logic she'd been handed somewhere earlier in her life. The logic that said love is proven by sacrifice, that care is measured by how much you're willing to give up, that someone who holds their ground must be withholding something. That was almost the harder part to reckon with. She genuinely believed that love expressed as yielding was the truest kind, and she genuinely believed, therefore, that any time I didn't yield, I was withholding love. The ledger wasn't malicious. It was load-bearing. It held up a whole architecture of how she understood relationships, and every time I declined to keep making deposits, she experienced it not as disagreement, but as withdrawal, as evidence that the balance was running low, as a kind of quiet abandonment she felt she was owed an explanation for. I understood all of this. I'd worked it out over time, the way you work out the design of a building by studying how the light moves through it at different hours. Not because I was looking for an indictment, but because I needed to understand it clearly before I could know whether I was misreading her or whether my read was accurate and the thing I'd been told I was misreading was real. It had started small. A preference overruled here. A plan reconsidered there. The subtle but unmistakable weight of her disappointment deployed at the exact moment I needed to feel light. I noticed it early, the way you notice a faint smell in a new apartment. Present, slightly off, nothing you'd mentioned yet, possibly something that would fade as you settled in. The problem came later, and it came in waves, and by the time I was sitting at my kitchen table writing my list on a Tuesday afternoon, I had already spent considerable time, more than I was proud of, understanding exactly what the waves were made of. The understanding hadn't come all at once. It had come the way most understanding comes, incrementally, with resistance, interrupted by moments of genuine doubt about whether I was being fair, whether I was the problem, whether some adjustment I'd failed to make was responsible for the distance between us. I'd had that conversation with myself thoroughly, many times from multiple angles, and I'd arrived repeatedly and without shortcuts at the same place, which was, I was not the problem. I had been a participant in a dynamic, but the dynamic itself had been constructed around someone whose tools for love had been fashioned to treat the people who loved her as resources to be managed rather than people to be met. And I couldn't fix that. And I had finally decided I was no longer willing to wait while it went unfixed. She came home that evening and saw the box and stood in the doorway of the hallway with her coat still on and her keys in her hand. "What's that?" "A box," I said. I was making dinner. I didn't stop. "I'm going to start packing over the next few days. I think it's time for me to move out." The silence that followed was not the quiet of surprise. It was the quiet of someone rapidly sorting through their available responses, testing each one for utility. I could feel it from across the kitchen without looking up. The silence had a texture to it. Busy, not still. "Move out," she said. "Yes." "You're serious." "I am." I heard her set her keys on the console table. I heard the soft thud of her coat going over the chair. I heard her cross the kitchen and pull out the stool on the other side of the counter and sit down, and I turned around because it seemed right to face her. She looked younger when she was scared. I don't say that unkindly. It was just something I'd observed and cataloged. Her features arranged themselves into an open, unguarded configuration that was very different from her everyday face. The careful composure she usually wore dropped away and left something more unfinished underneath. Right now, she looked exactly like that. "Where is this coming from?" she asked. "It's been coming for a while," I said. "I think you've known that." "I haven't known anything because you haven't said anything." "I've said several things," I said evenly. "I said them in June and again in September and again about 6 weeks ago. Each time we talked about it, you heard me, and then nothing changed." She opened her mouth and closed it. I watched her recalibrate. It was something she did, consciously or not, this rapid adjustment to new information, this search for the angle that would work. "So you're just leaving?" Without any real warning. "Cassandra," I said, with the same evenness I'd been maintaining since she walked in, "I want to be honest with you, and I'm going to be. But I've already made this decision, and the conversation we're about to have isn't one where I can be argued out of it. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know what kind of conversation this is." She looked at me for a long moment. Something behind her eyes moved through several phases. "What kind of conversation is it, then?" "An ending," I said. "A kind one, I hope, but an ending." She cried that night. Real tears, the kind that come from genuine hurt. And I sat with her on the couch for a long time and let her talk. She talked about the things she thought we'd had, the plans she'd imagined, the future she'd been building in her head with the confidence of someone who hadn't received sufficient signal that the foundation was shifting. She talked about specific memories, a weekend away early in the relationship, a night we'd stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. And I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt or correct or minimize. She'd loved me in her way. I was certain of that. Whatever else was complicated about her, whatever the ledger and the leverage and the architecture of her particular emotional logic, the love itself was not a performance. The grief of losing it was real, and real grief deserves to be witnessed without flinching. But I noticed even then the other thing running underneath it, like a second current beneath the surface of a river. The test built into certain questions. "Don't you love me?" Asked not quite as a question, not as an inquiry seeking information, but as a setup, a lever disguised as vulnerability. "If you love me, you wouldn't do this." A sentence structured so that whatever I said next would be either confession or concession. I answered carefully, honestly, without stepping into any of the traps, and I noticed her frustration at their failure, and I felt tired in a way that confirmed everything I'd already decided. It was the tiredness of someone who has been doing a particular kind of labor for a long time and has finally allowed themselves to see how much it has cost. We went to bed on opposite sides of the mattress. In the morning she was quieter, and I thought, maybe this is going to go the way it should. Maybe she's actually sitting with it. I made her coffee. We sat at the table. She looked at me with the expression I'd seen before, the one that preceded not a question but an announcement, a position that had been prepared in advance. "I think," she said, "that you've been very unfair." "Tell me why you think that." "Because you made decisions in your head and didn't tell me. And now you're presenting this as a done deal, and I don't have any say." "You had say?" I told her. "In June, in September, and 6 weeks ago, you had all the say in the world during those conversations. Those weren't breakup conversations. They were conversations about the specific things that have led me here. You knew they were serious. I didn't know they were ultimatums." I looked at her steadily. "They weren't ultimatums. An ultimatum would have been, change this by this date or I'm leaving. I didn't give you ultimatums. I told you how I was feeling and what I needed, and you told me you understood, and then the understanding didn't result in anything different. And I came back and told you again, and the same thing happened again." She was quiet. "That's not a pattern I can build a life around," I said. "I've thought about it very carefully, and I know that's true. I think you're being incredibly cold about this." "I'm being honest," I said. "I think you're reading clarity as coldness. I can see how that happens, but they're not the same thing." She didn't answer that. We finished our coffee in the quiet that wasn't peaceful. The packing happened in stages over the following week, and Cassandra oscillated through a range of approaches with an almost methodical quality that I might have found impressive under different circumstances. There was the guilt approach first. Quiet suffering, audible sighs, the performance of carrying an invisible weight in shared spaces, lingering in doorways while I taped boxes in the spare room, as though her proximity might slow the proceedings through sheer gravitational force. I acknowledged her pain when she made it explicit and otherwise continued taping boxes. Then the reasonableness approach, measured, a dull conversation about whether I'd really thought this through, whether I was perhaps going through something external, some unnamed pressure that was distorting my perspective, whether couples therapy might be worthwhile, whether we owed it to what we'd had to try one more thing before reaching a conclusion. I told her I'd thought it through, thoroughly and at length, and that my perspective felt clear rather than distorted, and that couples therapy was something I would have welcomed 6 months earlier when I'd raised the subject, and she'd said she didn't think anything was particularly wrong. She didn't have a ready answer to that last part. She pivoted. Then the tenderness approach. Sudden, whole warmth. The Cassandra from the dinner party in the early months. Funny and attentive and interested in everything I said, filling the apartment with the best version of what we'd had. A reminder of what good had felt like at its most real. I appreciated it, and I felt the pull of it, and I kept packing. Not because I was unmoved. I was moved more than I showed, but because I had learned, over the course of this relationship, to distinguish between the truth of a feeling and the conclusion it was trying to produce. The warmth was real. The conclusion it was aimed at was still wrong. The shift I'd been waiting for came on the evening of the 8th day. I was in the living room folding the last of my things into a bag when she came and sat across from me, cross-legged on the armchair, with her hands in her lap and an expression on her face that was new, or not new precisely, but sharpened in intensity one hadn't seen deployed quite this directly before. "You know," she said, "that if you walk out that door, I don't know what I'll do." I folded a sweater with deliberate attention. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not okay. It means you're taking away the thing that's been holding me together, and I don't know what's going to happen to me." I set the sweater in the bag. I looked at her directly. Here it is, I thought. This is the real load-bearing structure underneath everything else. This is what all the other approaches have been building toward. "I hear that you're in pain," I said, "and I want to be honest with you. I'm not going to use your pain as a reason to stay in a relationship that isn't right for either of us." That's a very convenient philosophy. "It's not convenient," I said. "It's necessary. There's a difference." I kept my voice level. I had no interest in making her feel worse than she already did, but I also had no intention of treating her pain as a mechanism for my decision-making, which was what she was asking me to do, whether she recognized it or not. She looked away. Her jaw moved. "So that's it," she said. "You just don't care." "I care," I told her. "Caring about you and leaving aren't mutually exclusive. You know that, I think, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." "I don't know that." She looked back at me, and her eyes were doing the specific thing that had always before reached down into my chest and rearranged my decisions. There was a skill to it, not practiced malice, but an instinct honed by years of it working on people who loved her. Because if you cared, this wouldn't be something you could do this calmly. "You've mistaken my peace for indifference," I thought. "You've seen steadiness and read it as absence. But explaining that isn't what this moment needs, so I won't. I'm going to finish packing tonight," I said. "And I'd like to sit with you for a while after, if you want that. Just talk or not talk. But I'm going to finish packing." She left the room. I finished packing. She did not come back that evening to sit with me. I heard her moving around in the bedroom, the particular sounds of someone existing loudly in an adjacent room. Drawers opening and closing with extra precision, water running longer than necessary, the television on and then off and then on again. I sat on the couch and tried to read, and after a while gave up on the book and just sat there in the quiet. I thought about the conversation I tried to have in September, how I'd laid it out as clearly as I knew how, sitting across from her at this same table, telling her that the pattern I'd been watching was real and had a cost. How she'd listened with the focused attention of someone who wanted to be prepared to answer. How she'd said she understood. How she'd been warm for a few weeks after, and then the warmth had receded and the pattern had reasserted itself with the easy naturalness of something returning to its default state. I noted that. I come back to in October and then November, and by the time I sat down with the legal pad, I had completed my analysis and arrived somewhere permanent. In the morning, she came out already dressed before I was fully awake, and stood over me with her arms folded. "I've been thinking," she said. "Okay, I think I've been too passive in this relationship. I think I've let you set the terms, and that's been my mistake." I sat up against the couch cushions and looked at her. "Go on. I think if I'd pushed back more, earlier, we wouldn't be here. I think I've accommodated things that weren't healthy and then resented you for things that were actually my own responsibility, and I haven't been willing to admit that until now." I took that in. It wasn't inaccurate in its specifics. There was something genuinely true in this self-assessment. "You might be right about some of that," I said carefully. "Then we could try differently," she said. "I can see things I couldn't see before. I want to try again with that understanding." "Cassandra, I know you're going to say no." She sat down in the chair across from me, and the composure she'd arrived with was thinning at its edges. "I know, but I want you to hear this. I've been genuinely thinking, not just strategizing, and I want to try again." I looked at her for a long moment. She meant it. That was the remarkable thing. She absolutely meant it right now, with this feeling present and alive. The insight was real. The desire was real. And I knew, because I had thought specifically about this possibility before I'd ever started packing, that the insight would remain real for some number of weeks, and then the feeling sustaining it would diminish, as feelings do, and the old patterns would reassert themselves, because patterns don't dissolve through sincerity alone. They require different wiring installed through different means, and nobody does that work sustainably when a relationship is the incentive. When the relationship is the reason, the work lasts only as long as the relationship feels precarious. The moment it feels secure again, the urgency quietly drains away, and what remains is the person underneath, unchanged. "I believe you mean that," I told her. "Then, and I think you should do that work," I said, "for yourself, because it will make your life genuinely better and your relationships genuinely more whole. But I can't be the reason you do it, and I can't stay while you're doing it, because that's not a clean dynamic. I'd always be waiting for the regression. You'd always be performing for an audience of one. That's not a foundation." Her chin moved. "I've already made my decision," I said. "I'm sorry. I had one bag left to pack." It was a deliberate structure, to leave that one bag for the final morning, because it gave the departure a ritual shape that I needed without quite being able to explain. There would be a final night in the apartment, and then a final morning, and then I would pick up the last bag and walk out of the door for the last time, and the chapter would close with the click of the latch behind me. The final night was a Thursday. We had dinner together, which was her idea, and I agreed because it seemed like the right kind of ending. A shared meal, something to mark the close of something that had been, for a long time, genuinely real. She made the pasta dish she made when she wanted to say something wordless, layered with more care than the recipe strictly required, and I appreciated it fully. We talked about other things, easier things, and for a little while the relationship existed in the past tense in a peaceful way, the way a good memory can coexist with a hard decision without either one undermining the other. "I'm glad I knew you," she said at one point, looking at her plate. "I'm glad too," I told her, and I meant it completely. She looked up. The smile she offered was sad and honest and entirely unperformed, and I thought, there you are. That's the real version. That's the one I fell in love with, and the one I'm going to carry forward. We cleaned up together without making it a thing, and I went to bed on the couch, and I lay there thinking about nothing in particular. Not the past, not the future, just the texture of the ceiling and the faint light from the window, the sound of the street outside, the ordinary material fact of being alive in a room at the end of a day. My mind was quiet in a specific way. Not numb, not exhausted, just settled. That was how I knew, more than anything else, that I was right. In the morning I made coffee and packed the last bag. It was a duffel dark green, the kind with 2 end pockets and a main compartment that always holds more than it appears to. I'd had it for years through several moves and one extended trip, and it had become over time the kind of object that accumulates meaning without fanfare, the thing you reach for when something important is happening. I packed it methodically, the last few items from the bathroom shelf, the chargers I'd kept plugged in because I'd needed them through to the end, the book from the nightstand that I'd been too preoccupied to read during the final week, a few odds and ends that had been waiting for this specific bag. The small framed photograph. I stood with it in my hands for a moment. She'd given it to me early in our time together. A print of something I'd mentioned admiring once. Found and framed without announcement. Left on the table one morning with no note because she'd said the thing spoke for itself. It had been one of the most purely generous gestures she'd ever made, and I'd genuinely loved it. I stood there holding it and decided to leave it. It belonged here in the life we'd shared, more than it belonged in whatever came next. Taking it felt like the wrong kind of keeping. I set on the shelf and zipped the bag. I'd have full walkthrough of every room. Kitchen, cleared, clean, nothing of mine remaining. Bathroom, same. Spare room, empty of the books and things I'd accumulated there. Bedroom, the bed made with a precision that felt like punctuation. Living room, couch where I'd been sleeping, cushions straightened, no trace of me remaining. I came back to the hallway. The duffel was there alongside the two larger bags I'd staged against the wall the night before. I looked at the configuration for a moment. Everything in order. Everything ready. I reached down and picked up the duffel and settled its strap on my shoulder and bent to take the handles of the two large bags and straightened up. Cassandra was standing in the entrance to the living room. She was dressed. Her hair was up. Her face had the quality of something deliberately composed, assembled with effort and held in place through an act of will. She'd clearly prepared for this moment, decided what she wanted it to look like and built it, and I could see the effort in it from across the hallway. The effort was not nothing. I gave it that. I want to say something, she said. Okay, I want to say that I think you're making a mistake. Her voice was steady. I think you'll understand that in time. I think in a year, maybe less, you'll look back at this and know that you had something worth holding on to, and you let it go, and you'll know that I saw it more clearly than you did. I listened to all of it. I let it land without deflecting. Whatever mechanism it was designed to engage, it deserved to be heard fully. Then I said, I hope I'll look back and know that I handled this with honesty and care. That's what I'm going for. Something shifted in her face. Small, precise, a needle moving a quarter inch on a dial. The composure developed a hairline crack. So that's all I get, she said. I've said everything I have to say. I said most of it over the last several months and the rest of it over the last week. I don't think there's anything I could add right now that would be useful. Useful. She said the word with a particular flatness, stripped of warmth, turning it over so I could hear how it sounded. Kind, I amended. Or true. I was looking for the right word. I think what I meant is true. A beat. Two. Goodbye, Cassandra. I turned toward the door and reached for the handle, and I heard the shift behind me. The change in air quality, the slight sound, the specific quality of sudden movement, and I turned back. She went down. Not a stumble, not a slow fold. She went down the way someone goes down when they have decided to go down, with an abruptness that was almost too clean, the weight of her dropping all at once to the floor of the hallway with a sound precisely calibrated to alarm. Her limbs moved in a pattern designed to suggest a seizure. Her eyes rolled back. The sounds she made were the sounds of serious physical distress, shaped with the precision of someone who had made them before and knew their effect. I stood very still. I breathed in, breathed out. I'll let the moment be exactly what it was. I have seen this before, I thought, not with bitterness, not with contempt, but with the simple, settled recognition of someone identifying a known quantity. The first time, I had panicked completely. We had been in the middle of a disagreement that had reached the point where my position was firm enough that the usual tools were failing, and she had gone down, and I had gone to her immediately. Hands reaching, voice raised, fear cutting through everything else, and the disagreement had dissolved in the fog of fear and relief, and we hadn't spoken about what had happened, and I had filed it away under things I didn't yet understand. The second time I understood it better. The context had been too precisely structured to be coincidence. Another specific kind of standoff, another moment where a firm position was about to produce a result she didn't want. The collapse had come at the exact right moment, and it had worked. Of course it had worked, because the person who loved her was frightened, and the person who loved her softened, and the evening rearranged itself around her recovery. I had filed it differently that time. By now I had filed enough to know the file completely. I set the large bags down. I reached in my pocket and took out my phone. I found the emergency line and dialed it with the same steadiness I would use to dial anyone else. No performance of calm required, because there was no panic to perform against. When the dispatcher answered, I told them, in a clear and level voice, that a woman had collapsed in my presence and appeared to be having a seizure. And I gave them the address, and I confirmed I would stay on the line. Then I sat down on the floor of the hallway, back against the wall near the door, bags beside me, and I waited. The thing about genuine calm, not performed calm, not the calm of someone gripping the wheel very tightly, but the real variety that comes from having completed your analysis and arrived somewhere permanent, is that it has a specific quality in a room. It doesn't argue. It doesn't react. It doesn't fill the space with counter-energy for a performance to feed on. It simply exists, steady and unreactive, like a wall that stays a wall regardless of what presses against it. I had been told once by someone whose judgment I respected that this kind of calm was very difficult to sustain and act against, that the act required a reaction to keep it going, and without the reaction, the energy of the performance eventually turned on itself. I sat on the floor and answered the dispatcher's questions. Cassandra maintained the performance for longer than I might have predicted. The commitment was genuine, whatever else was true. But there was something about the sustained absence of the response she'd been designing for. The panic, the immediate crumbling of resolve, the tender hands reaching, that made the performance increasingly difficult to hold. Like trying to shout in an empty theater and hearing only the echo come back wrong. I could see it from where I sat. The tiny involuntary adjustments, the fractional hesitations, the limbs that moved slightly wrong in the pauses between the intentional movements. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. 2 of them, moving with the brisk and practiced competence of people for whom this was a Tuesday morning among many Tuesday mornings. They came in with their equipment and went to Cassandra and spoke to her in the low, professionally modulated tones of people trained to be simultaneously reassuring and precise, and they began the protocols that their training and their profession required of them. Her vital signs were normal. Her pupils responded to light correctly. The patterns of muscle activity they assessed corresponded to none of the recognized signatures of the event being presented. Her awareness, when tested with the careful neutrality of clinical method, was present and unimpaired. The professionals noted all of this in the way that professionals note things, without editorializing, without accusation, without any visible signal that they were drawing the conclusions they were evidently drawing, though the conclusions were in the room as plainly as anything else. I sat on the floor by the door and watched. One of them came to me, a compact man, gray at the temples, with the particular face of someone who has become very good at being both thorough and respectful simultaneously. "You the one who called?" "Yes." "Can you tell me what you observed from the beginning?" I told him, precisely, in sequence, without interpretation or editorial. He wrote things on his clipboard and asked the follow-up questions that a precise account naturally invites. and I answer them all. Any history of similar episodes? He asked. I thought about that for exactly as long as it required. There have been previous episodes, I said, choosing each word with care, that were ultimately not found to have a medical cause. He wrote something. He said, "Thank you," with a professionalism that contained somewhere behind it. Not in his voice, not in his expression, but in the specific quality of the acknowledgement, a quiet recognition. Not judgment, nothing punitive. Simply the composed recognition of someone who has seen the shape of a situation and has no further questions about its nature. They completed their assessment. They packed their equipment with the efficient respect of people who have somewhere else to be and understand the value of that. They spoke with Cassandra quietly, and she answered them. And there was about the exchange the particular quality of a performance that has been examined by professional and unflattering lights and found without its makeup. She was fine, they concluded. All vitals normal. She should follow up with her physician if she had any concerns. There was no emergency requiring transport. They left. The door closed behind them with its ordinary sound. The apartment was very quiet. Cassandra was sitting on the floor of the hallway. Not collapsed, sitting with her knees folded to one side and her hands in her lap. The way a person sits when they have ended up somewhere they didn't plan to be and are deciding what comes next. Her face had a quality I'd only seen from her a handful of times before, stripped of every layer, every calibration, every prepared response. No angle, no architecture, nothing measured or deployed. Just her face, looking up at me, and in it something I could only read as the specific exposure of someone who has been seen in the middle of something they would have very much preferred to be private. I stood in the hallway. I held my keys. I looked at her for a long, clear moment, and I let what I felt about her grief be genuine and present and real because I had loved her. That was true. The love had been real. The good parts had been real. The dinner party and the 3 a.m. conversations and the wordless pasta and the photograph on the shelf. All of it had been real, and I carried it, and I would carry it for some time. None of that changed what I was about to say. I held the keys, and I looked at her, and I said, without anger, not without feeling, but without anger, because anger had never been any part of this. I am never going to build a life with someone who mistakes my love for a lever. She didn't move. I don't think she could in that moment. I hope you find what you're looking for, I said. I genuinely mean that. And then I picked up my bags and I opened the door and I walked out into the hallway. And I pulled the door closed behind me with the quiet deliberateness of someone closing a door at the end of an ordinary morning, and I walked toward the elevator with my bags and my keys and the particular calm of a person who has done the right thing by difficult means and knows it. The elevator came. I stepped in. The doors closed, and I watched the numbers descend, and I let myself feel fully and without management everything I was carrying. The real loss of what we'd had at its best, the relief of having finally done what I'd known for a long time I needed to do, the specific sadness of watching someone you once loved be their least dignified self at the final moment. All of it. I didn't sort it or suppress it or turn it into something useful. I just let it exist the way weather exists, present, real, already beginning to pass through. The lobby was bright and ordinary. The front door opened outward onto the street. I stepped outside. The air was cool with the particular quality of early morning, not yet fully committed to the day, carrying a trace of night in it still. I stood on the front step for a moment with my bags around me, and I breathed it in. Somewhere ahead of me, a new apartment, a legal pad with a list, 10 specific items to handle in sequence, each one finite and achievable. The ordinary logistics of a life being reorganized. I would handle all of it. I was good at that. I picked up my bags. I walked.
Thanks for listening.